Americans tend to describe themselves primarily with internal traits: ambitious, creative, compassionate. Chinese respondents, when asked the same question, describe themselves more often in terms of relationships and social roles: daughter, student, friend. This is not just a linguistic difference. It reflects a genuinely different self-concept that shapes how personality is construed, expressed, and even experienced across cultural boundaries. Researchers have administered Big Five personality measures across dozens of cultures and found that the five-factor structure replicates remarkably well in many different societies. This suggests that the Big Five may capture something about the natural structure of human personality that transcends particular cultural contexts. However, the average levels of traits differ substantially across cultures, and the factor's internal structure shows some variation. Individualistic cultures tend to produce stronger differentiation between factors, while collectivistic cultures show somewhat less distinct factor boundaries. The universality is real but not perfect. Harry Triandis and Hazel Marcus distinguished cultures that define the self as independent, bounded, autonomous, and the primary unit of agency, from cultures that define the self as interdependent, embedded in social relationships, defined partly by roles and obligations rather than by internal traits. In individualistic cultures like the United States, Australia, and Western Europe, personality is understood as a stable individual attribute. In collectivistic cultures like Japan, China, Korea, and many African and Latin American societies, personality is understood as more context-dependent and relational. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to over-attribute others' behavior to internal, stable personality traits while underestimating the role of situational factors. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you conclude they are an aggressive, inconsiderate person. You do not consider that they might be rushing to an emergency. Ross coined the term in 1977 to describe what he called the main bias in social perception. Importantly, the fundamental attribution error is larger in individualistic cultures than in collectivistic ones. The latter show more sensitivity to situational explanations, consistent with their interdependent self-concept. The actor-observer asymmetry describes the finding that when we explain our own behavior, we tend to cite situational factors. I was late because of traffic. While when explaining others' behavior, we tend to cite dispositional traits. They are chronically late because they are disorganized. This asymmetry exists because actors have privileged access to their own situational experience, while observers can see only the actor's behavior without seeing the situation. The asymmetry is one of the factors driving conflicts in relationships. Partners attribute their own misbehavior to circumstances while attributing their partner's misbehavior to character. Walter Mischel's 1968 book Personality and Assessment summarized evidence that correlations between personality traits and specific behaviors were rarely above 0.3, what he called the personality coefficient, while situational variables often predicted specific behaviors much more strongly. Mischel did not deny that personality exists, but argued that trait-based prediction of specific, single behaviors was inherently limited. His critique stimulated decades of research and ultimately the recognition that traits predict aggregated behavioral tendencies reliably, while situations predict specific behavioral instances, the interactionist resolution. Beyond the broad individualism-collectivism distinction, researchers have documented that cultural self-concept shapes how personality is expressed behaviorally. In interdependent cultures, behavior varies more across social contexts. What Westerners might interpret as inconsistent personality, because the self is explicitly defined by relationships and roles. A person might be assertive with subordinates, deferential with superiors, and warm with family, not as inconsistent personality, but as appropriate role behavior. This context sensitivity is not a symptom of weak personality, but a reflection of a culturally coherent self-concept. The self-enhancement motive, the tendency to view oneself more favorably than objective evidence warrants, is one of the most robust findings in social psychology when measured in Western samples. However, cross-cultural research reveals substantial cultural variation in its strength. East Asian samples show significantly weaker self-enhancement and sometimes self-critical or self-effacing tendencies in experimental tasks. This has been interpreted as reflecting cultural norms that emphasize humility, self-improvement, and attention to one's shortcomings rather than basking in achievements, consistent with the interdependent self-concept. Henrik, Heine, and Norenzayan's 2010 paper documented that the vast majority of psychological research, including personality research, is based on weird samples. Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic populations that represent only about 12% of the world's population. Research that is replicated only in weird samples cannot be assumed to represent universal human psychology. The cross-cultural study of personality reveals that while some basic psychological processes appear universal, perhaps reflecting evolutionary heritage, their expression, intensity, and cultural meaning vary significantly across societies. Personality is real, stable individual differences in behavior and experience that carry across contexts and time. But the concept of personality and how it is understood, measured, and expressed is also shaped by culture. The study of personality across cultures reveals both what is universal about human individuality and what is constructed by the specific social worlds we inhabit.